Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Learning podcast. My guest here today is Ray, who is the VP of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451. Ray, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, tell everyone a little bit more about Element 451 and what you guys are all about.
Sure. Element 451 is a really exciting company. We run an AI-driven student engagement platform working with over 300 schools across North America, specifically community colleges, four-year schools, higher education as a market. We actually came out of a marketing agency specifically designed for higher education. Our CEO, Artis Kadu, was one of the co-founders of that company and then spun this technology off about 7 years ago. I was actually a client when I worked at NYU and Cornell, where I brought this technology in for my enrollment management team to do better engaging students. And that was before we had the generative AI piece that we added a couple of years ago, which is really embedded in everything we do.
How have you found this whole AI thing to be implemented into business? And the reason why I'm asking is because now it's such a buzzword, right? Everybody just talks about AI, just AI this, AI that, and there's so many amazing things that you can do from it. There's also a lot of bad that can come from it if you use it the wrong way. So how have you found the implementation to help? And most importantly, when that implementation happens, what do you think are some of the best, most valuable ways to use AI?
Sure. I would say that there's still a lot of disinformation out there and a lot of fear. I think education is a key thing because there is a lot out there, but a lot of folks don't really understand what generative AI can do. In higher education, really, it's a force multiplier. It allows campuses and professionals to do more with less, to track the complete student journey in ways they couldn't before, and also to use generative AI as a way to better educate their campus, not just the students, but the other stakeholders on campus, because a generative AI can learn absolutely everything about a university and then provide that information in over 100 languages to prospective students, current students, faculty, staff, etc.
Yeah.
So it really is a knowledge base for the entire institution, as well as a tool for automation and being available 24/7.
Have you found that a lot of these institutions often don't have a lot of clarity of what's going on before you guys come in?
Unfortunately, that is the case. I think, again, there's a lot of education to be done. We recently did a survey with a professional association and found that about 40% of the folks working in that sector of higher education had little to no training whatsoever in AI. And I think a lot of folks have started using ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini and some of those other tools.
Yeah.
But the application to higher education is something quite different. And it requires some lift. But what we've been able to do is create a no-code interface that allows folks to use natural language to get done what they need to do. And the technology does most of it for them. I think they're very impressed when they see that and they understand the possibilities and the use cases of that technology.
Yeah. Do you think that, well, oftentimes the higher education space has, I'll just say more experienced people. I won't call them old, but more experienced people. And I've found that there's often a barrier of entry or a barrier of how do I actually use this thing in the best way possible? And a lot of them are just hesitant to try something new. What are some of the biggest challenges around that, and how have you guys been able to overcome that sort of thing to be able to engage with them and say, "Hey, this is something that's actually going to benefit you. Don't be scared of it."
Sure. I think, well, you can teach an old dog new tricks for sure. And I think
Yeah.
folks have adapted, especially if they want to stay current.
hmm
Unfortunately, I think what's forcing this function is a crisis in American higher education. Budget shortfalls. In some cases, I've heard of shortfalls upward of $20 million, where institutions are shedding staff. They're not recruiting the students they need to maintain tuition revenue, and they're being forced to do more with less. As a result, they don't want to hire, they can't hire, and they need inexpensive, flexible technology tools to do the same job and try to succeed in the marketplace. If you look at the number of college closures across the United States in the last couple of years, it's staggering. And it's an accelerating trend where a lot of small private schools that have been around, in some cases over 100 years, are
Yeah.
closing their doors because they can't maintain the revenue. And these are the kinds of tools that I think even for a more senior, seasoned professional in higher education, they see the imperative to be able to use technology in this way to survive.
Interesting. And do you think that trend of them trying to adapt as fast as possible is also increasing with time, or there's maybe a split between the people that are, hey, I'm willing to adopt it and I'll keep going, and the ones that are like, I'll just stick to what I've been using the entire time and hope for the best?
Well, it is kind of shocking for higher education, but I'd say it's a case of the quick and the dead.
Mm,
Unfortunately, if they're not willing to adapt, they're going to fail.
Yeah.
And many schools don't have an endowment to fall back on. They don't have donors that are ready to support them and are
Yeah.
tuition driven. You'd be surprised how many elite institutions are even tuition driven. And when you consider changes in federal funding for research in other places, there's going to be a crunch on the budgets of a lot of institutions beyond what's already there.
Mm.
So I think that, again, that is going to be the imperative. That is what's going to force this
Mm.
change. And no one wants to push AI down the throats of anybody,
Hmm.
but it's an elegant technology designed to help do more with less, and also to give folks a better sense of personalization. A
Mm.
lot of the work that's being done right now by institutions, it's very generic, and it doesn't really come off very well. It doesn't explain the institution
Yeah.
in the right way. And an AI can do that in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way on an individual student basis.
Mm, interesting. And I wanted to say something as well, which is I'm very glad I'm actually having a conversation with you out of everyone in the organization. And the reason for that is partly partly because of what I said to you before we actually started recording, which is partnerships and creating that sort of relationship in higher education. Oftentimes, you have to know that person, and if you know that person, then you're able to kind of intervene your way into those relationships. So I'm glad I'm having a conversation with you because you're the VP of strategic partnerships. So, what do you think are some of the best ways, and what has worked really well for you guys to be able to create a lot of those partnerships? Is it really just word of mouth and referrals? Is that kind of the only way possible, and that's the way that has to be? Or are there any other avenues that you found to also work really well and has been working really, really well for you guys too?
That's a really great question. There are synergies between organizations that work with similar institutions. And I think
Mm,
that's one of the first places we've found success is when we're working with an organization, a marketing communications agency, a technology service provider that already is working with some of our own clients, and they
mm,
can see the proof points. And it isn't necessarily about my personal connections. It's much more about how the product stands on its own.
mm,
I would also say that we're very selective about who we bring in as a partner. When we bring in a partner, we take it very seriously. We provide them with a lot of resources, and we want to make sure that there's a mutually beneficial relationship there.
mm-hmm,
So, as much as folks want to partner with an innovative AI organization, we want to make sure that that partnership bears fruit for both
mm-hmm,
of us, that we can deepen client relationships, explore new client relationships together.
mm,
And yes, there is a certain higher education network that is there. I have a PhD. I'm a faculty member at two institutions, so it does give me an entree to certain kinds of organizations where
sure.
I have a credential. It's almost a union card that gets me to the table to have those conversations.
Yeah. Do you think how important? Let's say you didn't have those credentials. How much more difficult do you think it would be to start those relationships and kind of get your foot in the door?
I think there's certain things you can do regardless of what credentials you have to make those kinds of relationships happen. I think a key thing for higher education is not to
Hmm.
hard sell. I think that folks in higher education are very sensitive to that. I've
Yeah.
had prospective partners and clients tell me that to my face, that they don't want to be
Mm,
sold. And as a result, there's a little more finesse required.
mm-hmm,
Sometimes that has to do with an understanding of how the institution operates. Sometimes
mm-hmm,
that has to do with being able to relate to certain stakeholders in their language, to talk about
mm,
things like enrollment management or student services in a way using cases and specific examples that resonate with those audiences. So
mm-hmm.
I think that there's stuff that can be done without
Yeah.
being a professor, and it has to do with a real deep contextual understanding.
Yeah, I think a lot of the chats that I've had with I would say majority of them often rely on relationships and that's networking, which is mostly built on trust, and they have that trust with people, and obviously if you trust someone and you are friends with them and they trust someone, you'll likely trust that other person as well. Would you say that's actually that's obviously a very high leverage activity for people? If you trust someone and it goes through, perfect, amazing. What are some other avenues that you think, or maybe that have worked really well for you guys? Obviously, that referral basis and word of mouth is always going to be a channel that people should leverage and should put effort within. But are there any other ones that you think are very effective as well in being able to create a lot of those that won't necessarily rely on the trust factor?
Well, I think trust is important regardless, but
Mm-hmm,
something that I've always been a big believer in is professional associations and conferences. When
mm-hmm,
you're standing around in an exhibit hall with other companies and potential partners, you're visible. And folks
mm-hmm,
hear about you and they may learn about you for the first time in that context. And
mm-hmm,
as a result, they kind of gravitate towards you and they want to know more. And that's
mm-hmm,
a great place to sort of network in that way, not just in terms of finding customers at an event like that, but
Yeah.
also synergies between organizations. And I think in addition to that, there is something to be said for third party endorsements, the
Mm,
credentials one can get from being considered for certain awards or
mm,
being named as a co-sponsor of an event. Ways to justify the credibility of the
mm,
organization through proof points beyond
mm.
just I trust you, I know your product. Maybe I don't know your product, maybe I don't know you, but oh gosh, I saw you on this list of the top 25 ed tech startups this year
Mm-hmm.
from Global Summit Ventures or
Mm-hmm.
ed tech awards. So those are the places I think you can really generate that credibility without having to be present in front of an organization or an individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it creates that sense of authority and reliability, even without, hey, I don't really know who you guys are, but this is something that's obviously of value. So it's really, really interesting. What do you think are some of the most important lessons? Maybe the challenges and the lessons attached to those challenges as you guys have been growing and obviously reaching the point where you're at now with Element 451.
Sure. Growth takes time. But I
Mm-hmm.
think growth brings in growth. I think, you look at a sort of a hockey stick approach to growth where it starts off very, slow and then all of a sudden, boom, it goes way up very fast.
Yeah.
And that inflection point is, I think, what you're looking for. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of businesses don't, unfortunately, small businesses don't make it past 5 years. A lot of them
Mm.
close at that point in part because they can't achieve that liftoff.
Yeah.
So what has been a barrier? Well, I think there's some hesitancy out there to adopting new technologies, whether it's
Mm.
AI or something else. There's a fear of integration. There's a fear of implementation. There's a fear of training. There's
Mm-hmm.
a fear that it's going to replace people's jobs. And,
Yeah.
and while some of that may be true, the way I like to posit it is that it allows folks to focus on the highest priorities. When you
Sure.
enable a technology like that, it does change people's jobs, but it allows them to focus on the things that they should be focused on rather than the things that just come to them. And that is
Mm.
a hard thing for some audiences to understand. There's a resistance to I've always done things this way, therefore I will
Mm.
continue to do these things this way, versus there are new innovative ways to do things. You just need to be a little creative and a little flexible. And unfortunately, higher education is not a industry that I would say is very agile and flexible. It's a
Yeah.
couple hundred years old in
Mm-hmm.
this country,
Yeah.
so it is sort of sometimes a difficult monolith.
Hmm. Do you think that's often because of lack of maybe the education of the people in the industry of what is possible and what they can do, or maybe the fear that we were talking about earlier and the hesitancy to innovate and try new things?
I would say it's both, but maybe the
Mm.
latter more so. It's funny when
Mm.
an organization, an institution tells me, well, we've been doing this for 150 years and we know what we're doing and we could do it
Yeah.
ourselves. And my answer to that is, well, you haven't been doing this for 150 years. And just because you've
Hmm.
been doing something for 150 years doesn't mean you've been doing it well or correctly. And
Yeah.
that is a hard pill to swallow for some institutions that pride themselves on their history, their
Hmm.
traditions, the way things have been done. They view that as a part of their character. Uh, Unfortunately, that can lead to a stagnation. That can lead to a navel gazing that says, we are the best. If I just keep looking at myself, I will eventually be perfect.
Hmm.
And without that external view, it's one of the reasons why I look at rankings as one tool for institutions to measure their success. While they're not the
Mm.
end all be all, and
Yeah.
frankly, there are some very flawed methodologies out there for university rankings, it is a
Mm.
way of looking at what's going on because change does not occur in a vacuum. As
Mm.
institutions grow and add technology, so are others. And they need to be observing that and look at examples out there. And there are some great ones of institutions
Mm.
like Arizona State University that has grown from a small regional public into one of the largest online schools in the United States. And that's
Mm.
a success story that, frankly, a lot of institutions aren't familiar with. So
Yeah.
just that's an example.
That's interesting. Is there anything specific, Ray, that you wish you knew before you started on this whole journey of what you got going on now, that you're like, oh, if only I could have done this one thing differently, it would have maybe sped it up much, much, much better than going through the tough lessons that you got to go through.
What an extraordinary question. Uh, I would say that learning not to take things personally. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
very easy when you're passionate about something to get very invested in it. And when things go well or don't go well, your emotions go with them. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important, especially in a rapidly changing dynamic environment where you're trying to achieve a market share or you're trying to be a part of a conversation. It isn't always going to work out, and it isn't always your fault.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a question of luck. Sometimes it's a question of timing. There
Mm.
can be a lot of reasons why things do or don't happen. So, as much as I would say not to take things personally, I would also, on the flip side, say don't congratulate yourself too much either when you're
Mm.
successful. Understand that it is sometimes a numbers game, and it is sometimes just you got in at the right moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that
Yeah.
understanding that fluidity and that it isn't
Mm.
all about you and it isn't all about who you are, it is a little bit
Mm.
about the market and what goes on in the world
Mm.
that determines success.
That's interesting. Are you a big reader, Ray?
I am.
Are there any books that jump out at you? I'm like, oh, this book changed the way that I think about being able to help a company grow. Is there any specific one that kind of jumps out at you?
Uh, well, there are two. There's a book called The 5 Minute Manager, which
Hmm.
I got the first time I ever managed a team. And it is a very straightforward way of looking at working with others and how to set expectations. There's
Mm.
another great book called Leadership and Self Deception, which was actually
Mm.
part of a Cornell course that I took, which helps you examine how to more effectively create relationships with other stakeholders, whether they're in your own company or not.
Hmm.
And understanding that many times we get caught in our own thinking and don't understand how the other person in a conversation feels or is perceiving things.
Mm.
And if we can get past that, we can be much more productive. I'm also a fan right now. I've been reading some of the books of Daniel Pink. And I think some of his thoughts on managing businesses and sales in particular are very interesting.
Huh. Interesting. The second book you mentioned, Leadership and Self Deception. Uh, is that correct? Leadership
Yeah,
and
it
Self
is.
Deception.
That's correct.
Yeah, that reminded your description of that book reminded. Are you familiar with Patrick Lencioni?
I'm not.
So Patrick Lencioni has a book called The Motive, which reminded me of your description there, which is just being able to lead and manage people the correct way, as opposed to the, I guess, the usual way people are like, "Hey, do this and do that." And I think it's a very short read, if I remember correctly. It's like you can probably do it in like 60 minutes, but I think it's one of the most powerful books as well that within that topic, within that realm, that had a great impact on me too. So thank you for sharing those. I always like getting those book recommendations. I have two more questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, one of them is the one that I've been asking everyone, which is if you had a magic wand and you could just wave this beautiful wand and it would solve just one thing within the business. I know there's often a million, but just one thing that would make you guys reaching your goals, that would make you reach your goals much faster. What would that one thing be?
Make it easy for organizations to change their systems. You know, I
Mm,
think there are two reasons why it's difficult for an organization to change its systems. One is that it's deeply embedded in the business processes. And number two is that fear that we talked about, that I now have to do
mm,
different things. I have to learn new things. I have to do things in a new system. That entrenched systems thinking is a barrier to innovation. And
mm.
it's unfortunate because I'm sure every system that's implemented by, for example, a university says it's innovative. And in
Yeah.
fact, it can become an albatross around the neck of that organization. So I would say that kind of flexibility
Mm,
where I could say, you know what, I want to make a change. So I'm going to lift this system up. I'm going to move it over here and I'm going to replace it with something else. And that's
mm-hmm.
going to work within the organization. If I could wave a magic wand, I think I would do that.
I like that. I really like that. Yeah. And then last question here for you, which is actually not a question from me. It's a question from the last guest. If you're familiar with Stephen Bartlett from Dire CO, he does something like this, and I really like it. So I'm humbly took it from his podcast as well. You ready for the question?
Sure.
Okay. How do you show your team members that you value what they do?
I love that. Um, when I manage a team, I make time for one on ones. I think that's something that's less and less common. I think it's important, even just to provide a forum
Mm,
for team members to share their ideas, their frustrations. Even if I can't solve those frustrations or eliminate barriers, I can be a sounding board, almost a therapist
mm,
to help them process those challenges and then also show that I'm deeply invested in their success, whether that's at the organization we're working at or beyond.
Mm.
That type of investment of time and attention is very valuable in fostering a real mutual trust and respect with the team.
Awesome. I
That's my
really, really
opinion.
like that. Yeah, I really like that. I think oftentimes the people that drive the team or the business the most are the ones that are also neglected because they do so well. So it's like, oh, they don't need the attention. But I really like that answer. So thank you so much, Ray. I appreciate your time. Where should people go if they want to learn a little bit more about Element 451?
Sure, there's plenty online at element451.com. We also operate our own podcast network. It's the largest podcast network in higher education, Enrollify, and folks can go to enrollify.org for a lot of great thought leaders and creators talking about all kinds of topics. Some of them related to AI, but others related to different parts of higher education. I hope you check it out.
Awesome. Ray, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.